They became the most decorated unit in U.S. military history. This is the story of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the Nisei soldiers who never backed down. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, thousands of Americans of Japanese ancestry suddenly became suspects in their own country. They were not charged with crimes. They were not tried in court. They were simply labeled unsafe. Not because of what they did, but because of who they were. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. It allowed the military to relocate civilians from so-called military zones in the name of national security. More than 120,000 people were affected by this order. Most of them were born in the United States. Many had never been to Japan at all. They were sent to relocation camps, Topaz, Manzanar, Poston, Minadoka. Life there was controlled and harsh. Dusty barracks, barbed wire, guard towers, searchlights at night. Families tried to hold on to normal life. They built schools, printed newspapers, and worked wherever they were allowed. Hope was the only heir they had left. Among them were men who had already been serving in the U.S. Army before the war. They were removed from their units and sent to the camps simply because of their ancestry. For many, that was the hardest part. Yesterday they were soldiers, today they were prisoners of suspicion. But instead of breaking, something else began to grow inside them, a will to prove who they really were. In 1943, the U.S. War Department announced that Japanese Americans were allowed to volunteer for combat duty. It was a chance to return to service, a chance to fight for their country and clear their name. But first, every volunteer had to fill out a loyalty questionnaire. 2 questions caused anger and confusion. One asked if they were willing to serve in combat, and another demanded that they forswear any loyalty to the Japanese emperor. For men born in the United States, that question sounded like an insult. They had never owed loyalty to Japan in the first place. Still, thousands signed the form, not because they agreed with it, but because they refused to let anyone else decide who they were. They didn't want to argue. They didn't want to complain. They wanted to fight. They came on their own. Not by draft. Not by order. They volunteered. When the call went out for a new combat unit, the line of volunteers formed before sunrise. They stood in silence, holding their papers in cold hands. There were no speeches, no applause, no promises, only a simple decision. Step forward or step back forever. For them, this wasn't just enlistment. It was a choice, prove themselves or be forgotten. They had no guarantees, no respect, no welcome. Their families were still behind barbed wire, guarded by soldiers of the same army they chose to join. Their homes were gone, their businesses seized, their names doubted, but they still signed up. The U.S. Army gave them a number, 442nd Regimental Combat Team. But nobody called them by a number. They were Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans. Born in the United States, raised as Americans, loyal to one home and one flag, but forced to fight for the right to prove it. Here is what truly matters. They didn't come for revenge. They came to win back their place in their own country. For them, the oath of enlistment was not routine. Many swore it next to the graves of their parents, who had died in the camps. Others left from relocation barracks straight onto troop trains. Every man carried something no document could show: doubt, pain, pride, and a silent promise. But inside the 442nd, something unexpected happened. They didn't think the same. They didn't feel the same. But they stood together. There were men who still trusted America. Men who trusted only their brothers in arms. Men who carried anger, but refused to break discipline. And men who simply decided, if death comes, let it come with honor. The 442nd became a unit unlike any other. Inside its ranks were farmers, mechanics, factory workers, boxers, football players, students, teachers, men from every kind of life. Some had never fired a rifle before, but their will to endure made them stronger than anyone expected. Among themselves they joked, "There's only one direction forward. Behind us are the camps. Ahead is the war. There is no middle ground." But before they could face the enemy overseas, they had to face the first enemy at home. Doubt. In training camps, other soldiers didn't see them as a regiment. They saw them as an experiment. The Nisei were given old gear, worn-out boots, and rifles rejected by other units. They were told, almost openly, "If you want to be soldiers, earn it." And they did. They didn't know yet that they would one day become the most decorated unit in U.S. history. But they had already made their decision. They would go all the way. That was the beginning of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Ahead of them was not just war. Ahead of them was a mission: prove they were Americans. The 442nd was sent to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, a training ground in the American South. There was no front line there, no enemy fire, but a different kind of war began. A war to earn the right to be called soldiers. From the first day, the Nisei faced not hatred, but suspicion. Other units didn't know who they were. Japanese-American soldiers whose families were held behind barbed wire by their own government. Men who looked like the enemy, yet wore the uniform of the United States. It wasn't open hostility, it was silent doubt. They were tested, watched, judged, waiting for them to break. They didn't. Training was brutal. Forced marches with full packs for miles. Live-fire drills that pushed endurance past the limit. Tactical exercises where their objectives were made harder on purpose. Falling behind was not allowed. Camp Shelby was not just a training ground, it was an examination. And the Nisei did more than pass it. In drill, they ranked first. In discipline, they set the standard. In marksmanship, they were among the best. Go for broke stopped being a saying. It became policy. Slowly, the doubt around them began to fade. Not because people suddenly liked them, but because discipline and performance leave no room for argument. The 442nd found a commander who believed in them, Colonel Charles W. Pence. He didn't see them as a political risk. He saw them as soldiers. His rule was simple. First, the job. Then, the talk. And the job never stopped. Inside the unit grew a relentless work ethic. No excuses. No complaints. Every man in the line pulled his weight. They didn't wait for respect. They earned it. The turning point came at Sweatman Field during full-scale combat exercises. The 442nd went up against a veteran U.S. infantry unit. Officially, it was just training. In reality, it was Judgment Day. Their opponents underestimated them. That mistake cost them the exercise. The Nisei executed a flawless flanking maneuver, cut the enemy line, and encircled the entire opposing force in minutes. No casualties. No confusion. Clean and professional, exactly the way real combat demands. Doubt collapsed. Rumors stopped. From that day on, the 442nd was no longer questioned. It was respected. For the first time, the U.S. Army wrote in an official report, "High combat readiness, absolute discipline, fully dependable." And only after that line appeared on paper, they were cleared for overseas deployment. They were going to war, but they already carried something most units didn't. They had nothing to go back to. And men who have nothing left to lose do not break. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team arrived in Europe in the spring of 1944. Their first battlefield was Italy, a place that separated soldiers by one rule: survive or be forgotten. No one cared about their past or their motives here. The only thing that mattered was whether they could fight. They were assigned to the 34th and 5th U.S. Armies. Some officers doubted them. Some openly expected them to fail. It didn't matter. Respect is not issued, it is earned under fire. Their first major test came at Anzio. It wasn't a glorious battle. It was a slow, grinding war of trenches and mud. German artillery pounded their lines day and night. Mortar shells fell so often that men stopped reacting to explosions. Cold. Sleep deprivation. Casualties every day. But the 442nd never gave up a position without orders. And that was noticed. They weren't better equipped. They weren't protected. They simply did not break. Next came the brutal climb against the Gothic Line, Germany's fortified mountain defense in northern Italy. Steep cliffs, hidden bunkers drilled into stone, machine gun nests with perfect fields of fire. Every advantage belonged to the enemy. But the Nisei didn't ask for easier routes. They made their own. They climbed at night, crawled through rocks, threw grenades into bunkers at point-blank range, took prisoners, secured ridges, and kept going. They were not labeled as an elite unit on paper, but in the field they fought like one. For the first time, reports from frontline commanders began to use one word to describe them. Reliable. That word spread faster than any rumor. The 442nd was no longer seen as an experiment. No one asked them, "Why are you here?" anymore. They had proven it. But ahead of them wasn't victory. Ahead of them was the battle that would define their legacy. A mission no one wanted. A mission they would not refuse. France. The Vosges Mountains. An American battalion was surrounded and left to die. Only one unit was ordered to reach them. October 1944. Vosges Mountains, France. Cold forest. Mud. Fog. The perfect ground for an ambush and a grave. The 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, men from Texas, had advanced too far and were cut off by German forces. 275 American soldiers were now surrounded, trapped on a forest ridge with no way out. They were low on ammunition, low on food, low on hope. Attempts to reach them had already failed. Casualties were heavy. The division was running out of time and options. The message from the front was clear. They will be wiped out within 24 hours. One unit received the order that no one wanted. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team would break through or die trying. They moved silently into the forest, only rifles and grenades with them. No support vehicles could get through the terrain. It would be infantry against entrenched German positions. The enemy held the high ground. Machine guns raked every slope. Mortar fire pinned down every path. The Germans believed no one would break through. They didn't know the Nisei. The 442nd attacked through the trees yard by yard in brutal close combat. Every hill was a fight. Every meter was paid for in blood. Casualties rose. Officers were among the first to fall. Leadership passed to sergeants, then to corporals, and still they advanced. The reports from headquarters said only, "The 442nd continues its attack." By the 5th day, the situation was near impossible. Exhaustion set in. Ammunition was running low. Men fought without sleep. Many continued despite wounds, refusing evacuation. The final enemy stronghold stood on a steep, fortified slope later known as Bonsai Hill. Barbed wire, landmines, machine gun nests, mortars. Taking it meant heavy losses. Not taking it meant failure and death for the lost battalion. The order was simple: take the hill. And they did in a direct assault. No armor support, no artillery barrage. Just men who refused to stop. When bullets ran out, they charged with bayonets. When they reached the top, it was hand-to-hand combat. And they won. They broke the German line. The lost battalion had waited 6 days. Surrounded. Outnumbered. Then came the words they had stopped believing they would hear. "This is the 442nd. We're here. You're going home." Of the 275 Texans, 211 survived. The 442nd paid a terrible price. Over 800 killed and wounded during the rescue. This was not a victory. This was a sacrifice. After that day, no one in the U.S. Army questioned who the Nisei were. They weren't an experiment. They weren't Japanese. They were American soldiers. And for many, legends. Official reports, record numbers, positions taken, enemy strongholds destroyed, casualties sustained. But war is not made of numbers. It is made of men and the cost they are willing to pay. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team became the most decorated unit of its size and length of service in U.S. military history. 9,521 awards for valor. 21 medals of honor. 4,000 Purple Hearts. But each decoration came at a cost. Lives changed or lost forever. After the rescue of the lost battalion, they were called heroes. But the men of the 442nd did not use that word. Heroes, they said, were the ones who finally made it home. And they didn't know if they ever would. Many of them stopped writing letters back to the camps. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know what to say. How do you tell your family, still behind barbed wire, that you're fighting for a country that doubts you? Lieutenant Rudy Tokiwa once said, "We weren't born heroes. We just didn't have the luxury of failing." The 442nd kept moving. Southern France, the Rhone Valley, the Riviera, then back to Italy, the Po River Valley. Battle after battle, assignment after assignment. They were used as an assault unit sent where the fighting was hardest. Commanders knew, if there was a job that had to be done, no matter the cost, send the Nisei. They never refused an order. They never broke. The casualties were devastating. In some rifle companies that went in with 200 men, barely 20 to 30 were left standing after weeks of combat. Others had to be rebuilt from scratch in the middle of the war. A U.S. general once summed it up. The 442nd fought not because they were told to, but because they refused to be anything less. Why did they keep going? Why keep fighting when the price was so high and the reward so distant? Each man had his own answer, but in the end, they were all the same: family, honor, name. Their families were still in camps, living behind fences and guard towers. There was only one way to change anything: win. Not to be forgiven, not to be thanked, but to earn respect the only way possible, with action. They didn't demand recognition. They didn't ask for sympathy. They just kept going. Across the U.S. Army, one phrase began to follow them from battlefield to battlefield. The Nisei never quit, but ahead of them waited a test greater than combat. A test not of strength, but of character. History remembers battles, medals, victories, but there are things that don't make it into military reports. The moments when a soldier has to decide not how to fight, but how to remain human. For the 442nd, that moment came not in a battle but after one. While advancing through Europe, the Nisei liberated towns that had been dragged through years of occupation. They shared their rations with starving civilians. They carried wounded villagers to safety. They protected children in streets still filled with landmines. They did their job as soldiers, but they did more as men. Then they found Dachau, not the main camp but one of its subcamps. A place built not for war, but for breaking people. Starvation, disease, men reduced to bones. They had heard rumors, but now they saw it with their own eyes. And they stopped. Even after the worst battles, after days without sleep, after losing brothers in combat, nothing prepared them for this. Some survivors were too weak to speak. Others cried when they saw the Nisei. This time, the soldiers didn't speak either. They gave their food. They cut the locks. They carried people out who hadn't walked in months. The war had stripped away a lot: comfort, safety, innocence, but not their humanity. The 442nd was built on discipline and endurance. But compassion was part of their strength too. They understood something most soldiers never would: what it means to live while your freedom is taken away. When you are judged not by who you are, but by what you look like. They had seen fences, guard towers, and the fear in innocent people's eyes before the war. So when they saw suffering, they didn't turn away. Not because it was their duty, but because it was right. There are no medals for moments like this. No parade mentions them. They exist only in the memories of those who were there. But this was part of the 442nd story, not just how they fought, but who they were. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. For most American soldiers, that meant one thing: home. But for the men of the 442nd, home was not a place. Home was behind barbed wire. There were no parades waiting for them. No flags. No cheering crowds. Many did not return to cities or neighborhoods. They returned to relocation camps: Topaz, Manzanar, Poston, Hart Mountain, the very places where their families had been held during the war. Imagine it. Soldiers wearing uniforms, ribbons, and combat patches, stepping off troop trains and walking back through guarded gates. They had survived some of the hardest battles in Europe, but now had to show papers to enter a camp in their own country. America didn't look away from this contradiction. America simply didn't comment on it. In the U.S. archives, there is a simple report about their return. The 442nd came back without complaints. No protests, no anger, no speeches. They did what they always did: they went to work. They rebuilt farms and businesses, found new jobs, married, raised children. They did what they fought for, they rebuilt life. But reality didn't change overnight. Prejudice didn't end with a signature or a victory. Some were denied housing. Some were threatened. Some were told to go back where they came from, even though they were born in America. So they responded the only way they knew, not with words, with character. Their code was the same in peace as it was in war. First the work, then the talk. Years passed, slowly, but things changed. Suspicion faded. Respect grew. People who once doubted them began to study them. Military academies invited them to speak. Their story entered the history books, not as a controversy but as an example. And their motto, "Go for broke," no longer belonged to one regiment. It became an American phrase. But one thing was still missing: recognition. It took more than 50 years. But in the year 2000, the United States Congress awarded the 442nd RCT the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor in America. Not as a gift, not as an apology, but as a statement. They never asked for trust. They earned it. The 442nd didn't fight for glory. They didn't ask for fame. They never tried to be heroes. They did their job, and they did it better than anyone expected. After the war, they disappeared from the front pages. They became mechanics, farmers, teachers, lawyers, engineers, doctors. They didn't wear their medals. They didn't talk about what they did in the war. Their lives were quiet, but their legacy was not. Their story began to spread without noise, in classrooms, military lectures, leadership courses. West Point and other academies still study their campaigns as examples of unit cohesion, discipline, and absolute commitment to mission. They weren't made heroes out of sympathy. They were recognized because they proved what a soldier truly is. Some of them came home with missing limbs. Some carried scars under their uniforms. Some never slept the same again. They had given everything, and still they refused bitterness. They never preached hate. They never blamed their country. They rebuilt it by being part of it. Their motto, "Go for broke," didn't come from a slogan. It came from life, from betting everything on a mission when failure was not an option, from pushing forward even when they were alone, from believing that honor is a choice, especially when it costs you something. The 442nd RCT became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in United States military history, not because they were Japanese Americans, not because they had something to prove, but because they refused to surrender on the battlefield or in life. History remembers what they did, but it remembers something greater: who they were. The world called them many things, but one word fits best: soldiers.